The Cold War arguably began on the 5th of March 1946 with Churchill's Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri. The Cold War became much more noticeable for the general public with the Berlin airlift in 1948. By the time the Conservatives had won the 51 election and taken over the reins of power in Britain, the Cold War was very clearly in full swing with the outbreak of the Korean War the previous year and British troops deployed to the Pusan perimeter. The question we're addressing today, however, is how far the British politics of the period of conservative domination, which lasted until 1964, continued to be shaped by that background issue of the Cold War, pervasively affecting all areas of politics and life. After all, Vicky's famous cartoon on this slide of Harold Macmillan, then the Prime Minister, carrying on an act as Super Mac, suggests that what was really going on in the late 1950s was Britain trying to pretend to remain a global player, a great power, whilst not really having any more the wherewithal or capacity to do so. But even so, this, as Macmillan's diaries themselves reveal, was partly driven by the context of the Cold War, a context which meant that British troops continued to be heavily deployed around the world, not least in Germany in the form of the British Army of the Rhine, and that every episode in the process of decolonisation that Macmillan presided over in his years as Prime Minister between 1957 and 1963 had as its backdrop the question of what would happen in terms of the Cold War when the British pulled down the flag. In other words, to use a term which only really came into vogue in the 1980s, the Cold War context meant that British politicians in the 1950s became used to trying to punch above their weight, an exercise which they pursued by the nature of the relationship they forged, and Macmillan more than practically any other British Prime Minister, with the Presidents of the United States of America. This, of course, points to the extent to which Cold War politics affected the external policies of Britain. But what I'm going to be suggesting in this lecture is that the Cold War also had significant implications for British domestic politics as well. Let's deal with the external aspects of the Cold War first. So on this slide we can see firstly the explosion of Britain's first, in inverted commas, nuclear device in Kiribati in 1957. The first British A-bomb, 1952. This device didn't have the yield that a nuclear weapon was supposed to have, but it essentially demonstrated that the British had the technology and led subsequently, after the Russians had launched Sputnik later that year, to the Americans agreeing to restore the sharing of nuclear secrets with the British, which happened during the Second World War and was abruptly ended by the McMahon Act, passed by Congress in 1946. One key objective of British foreign policy in the 1950s achieved. The process of achieving that, however, operates against a backdrop of increasingly dark circumstances in Europe. These often revolved around the city of Berlin, divided between the East and the West at the end of the Second World War. Whilst Macmillan, as Foreign Secretary in 1955, had been a party to the signing of the State Treaty of Austria, which allowed Austria to re-emerge as a state with neutrality by the agreement of both the East and the West, Berlin remained a sore matter between the two sides. In 1958, Khrushchev, the strongman of Russia, made noises about securing what was West Berlin, something which prompted great anxiety on the part of Konrad Adenauer, the West German Chancellor. And Adenauer was even more annoyed when Macmillan decided to go to Moscow in 1959, shake hands, as we see here, with Khrushchev under the pictures of Lenin and Marx, and try to open out peace negotiations with the Russians. From the British point of view, however, their concerns were not just about Europe, but about the massive commitments they had around the world, not least with the continuing demission of empire. The British wished, therefore, to explore opportunities for what Khrushchev called peaceful coexistence, perhaps more than some of their Western allies. Macmillan also had a domestic reason for pursuing these options. In the late 1950s, there was growing international concern about the increasing tempo of nuclear tests and the risk of creating a nuclear winter, if you like. This is an early stage of the environmental movement. Part of the consequences of this was a letter that, or publication that J.B. Priestley wrote in the New Statesman, which then led to the founding of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament in 1958. Macmillan goes into 1959, an election year, conscious of the growing concerns of about CND and about the way in which the Senate was trying to capture the Labour Party and make nuclear weapons a major issue in that election. As it happened, Macmillan won that election with a majority of about 100, but the concern remained very much there. He remained, for the rest of his period as Prime Minister, focused very much upon ways to achieve some kind of test ban treaty and the first measures towards nuclear, de-escalation of the nuclear arms race, a process which culminated in a degree of success a couple of months after this photo was taken of CND protesters outside his country home in Sussex, when the partial test ban treaty was signed in Moscow. One way in which the Cold War impacted upon the process of decolonisation was the anxiety that the British had that when they left, the successor states would turn towards the east, so they needed to try and keep them in the Western orbit with defence deals and trade deals and so on. A particular example of this is the way in which the Egyptian strongman Nasser in 1955 decided to go for a arms deal with Czechoslovakia, part of the Soviet bloc. NASA was not shifting to the east, but that's how it was interpreted. The West then cancelled the credits that he needed for the building of the Aswan Dam, and in order to get the money, he nationalised the Suez Canal, with consequences which led to the British and French action against Egypt, the Suez Crisis in late 1956. We can see a Cold War dimension as well in the ongoing colonial crisis in the strategically important colony of Malaya, strategically important because of supplies of rubber. Occupied by the Japanese during the war, the British get back in, and by the late 1940s, there's a nasty guerrilla war broken out with the Malayan Communist Party. Same kind of conflict between communists and the reassertion of Western power that you see in Korea, where the war breaks out in 1950, or indeed in Vietnam, which during the course of the 1950s, Vietnam and the whole of formerly French Indochina, where after the British have tried to get the French back in there at the end of the war, the French get kicked out in 1954, and by the end of the 50s, early 60s, the Americans are being dragged into an ongoing conflict as well. So you have a series of conflicts in what was then called the Third World, the rapidly decolonising Third World, over whether they're going to be aligned with the West or with the East. There's also, however, a domestic side to this as well. You can see this right from the get-go with the front page of the Daily Mirror on the day of the 1951 election, playing upon the idea that Churchill may be a great war leader, but that's what he's most interested in. As it turned out, Churchill spent most of his peacetime government, 1951 to 55, seeking some kind of rapprochement with the Soviets, particularly after Stalin's death in March 1953. On the 11th of May 1953, Churchill makes a major speech holding out an olive branch to Malenkov, the new leader of the Soviet Union. So again, we can see how the Cold War affects the perception of British leaders and the kind of way in which they're represented. And the final way in which the Cold War really becomes embedded in British politics is through the centrality in this period, or the growing centrality, of workplace industrial relations. In the late 1940s, under the Attlee government, there has been growing anxiety about wildcat unofficial strikes breaking out in British industry. During the 1950s, anxiety is that these are driven by agents provocateurs, by communists who are promoting the industrial action so as to undermine the British ability to fight. Becomes a growing anxiety, particularly with the communist takeover of the electrical trade union. And the two films featured here at the end of the 1950s, to some extent, pick up on some of the propaganda that Conservative Central Office have been putting out in the late 1950s, that you see in these armaments factories, left-leaning trade unionists undermining the efforts of British industry, though it should be said, I'm all right, Jack, actually lampoons absolutely everyone, not just the left-leaning trade unionist played by Peter Sellers so brilliantly, the front man in this picture. Of course, the Cold War is not the only facet of British politics in these years, though I'm going to be arguing that it is a component in all the prisms through which British politics is seen in this period. This goes from the first two explanations offered more or less contemporaneously for this period. The notion put forward in the Labour document compiled successively from 59 to 1964, which eventually was called 13 Wasted Years, that the Tories had failed to modernise the British state and the British economy during their long years in power, being the first of these. The other contemporary publication that we should think about was the notion that one of the ways in which the Tories were able to stay in power for all of this time without massively modernising the economy was because they shifted attention from production to consumption. They controlled rationing by 1954. They built houses rather than new infrastructure. This is the accusation. And they allowed a consumer boom to let rip, with hire purchase and white goods and TV screens all becoming increasingly common in people's households by 1964. That what we saw was the politics of affluence, which bought off a section of the working classes who thereby voted for a continuation of affluence, as the Tory slogan in 59 had put it, life's better under the Conservatives, don't let Labour ruin it. And that the Conservatives were therefore able to stay in power simply by offering tax cuts and growing consumption. These, however, are not the only arguments that are put forward here. What we see with this array of books is a number of other ways in which we might think about the period. Firstly, to take up that point about affluence. In his book published some years ago, Lawrence Back argues that it's not just that the Conservatives used affluence successfully, but the Labour Party, with the possible exception of Tony Crosland's The Future of Socialism, published in 1956, failed to see a changing society and remained to some extent locked in arguments which didn't entirely speak to their target constituency. And that it's only in the early 1960s, particularly after Harold Wilson becomes leader of the party in early 1963, that they were able to come up with a language of modernity themselves, which was capable of challenging the Conservatives' hegemony. In addition, there are a number of other interpretations of this period we should think about, interpretations which focus upon ideas of what the dominant tone of politics was. One is that the Conservatives were able to stay in power because there was a political consensus, that they accepted the welfare state by and large that they'd inherited from the Labour Party, that they accepted by and large the nationalisations that the Attlee government had carried out. So there were only two denationalisations which occur in those 13 years, one of road haulage and the other of steel and the iron and steel industry. And that thereby we see a broad consensus that there's no need for the people to turn to Labour in order to defend the welfare state, because the Conservatives are not attacking it. Indeed, they're very careful to avoid getting into hot water over pensions when Labour make that the central plank of their election platform in 1959. The final 2 points that this slide raises, which are perhaps of more importance as we run forward, are one about decolonisation. So we have on the slide Roy Welensky's memoir of his time as Prime Minister of the Central African Federation. A feature of this period which breaks up in 1963 and is replaced in terms of the problems of decolonisation that Wilson, when he becomes Prime Minister, has to deal with after 1964 with the running sore called Rhodesia. The other, the reason why I mention this is because Central Africa, particularly in the late 1950s, early 1960s, takes up so much British political time compared to all the other aspects of the demission of empire, not least because it is settlers, white Europeans, who were embedded in power in that setting. The other, which also runs forward, is the book by Mark Jarvis on Conservative governments, morality and social change. You may be familiar with the idea that Dürer marks the end of a post-war period of privation and social conservatism, and sees the emergence of what comes to be called the permissive society. Except, of course, you could argue that the first tentative steps towards that take place in the late 1950s under a Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, who is not actually that any more liberal than his successor, but one Harold Wilson. So you see the Homicide Act 1957, you see the Licensing Act 1962, you see the introduction of independent television, you see the shifts towards allowing more gambling, for instance, the premium bonds introduced by Macmillan in the 1956 budget when he was Chancellor. So, in other words, Britain in the 1950s is not only becoming more of a consumer society, it's also becoming a slightly more socially and culturally liberal society. So we can see that there are themes for the politics of 1951 to 64 which are not entirely related to the Cold War, although if we pick up on that notion of modernisation, for instance, the backdrop to that is that if we're going to compete in the Cold War, we need to modernise. Well, how much does the Cold War come out in the general election themes of the period? Well, we have on the slide a series of posters from 1955, and you can see top level talks. Send Attlee, still then the leader of the Labour Party. That's absolutely about the Cold War. For peace through strength, vote Conservative. Again, that's absolutely about the Cold War. Working for peace under a picture of Anthony Eden, recently anointed as the new Conservative Prime Minister. Again, absolutely about the Cold War. And Eden was then the man who the year before had brokered peace in Indochina, the last major peace conference led by the British. But if you look at the themes of these general elections, we can see that perhaps the theme is more around economic. This is a period in which class-based voting seemed to be absolutely at its height. And because this is also the period in which the study of elections really takes off, that then becomes the dominant theory for explaining how people behave for the rest of the 20th century. Class-based voting is also seen to be the dominant theme because in all the elections of this period, the two major parties between them always get at least 90% of the vote. If you look at the subjects that dominate the elections of this period as well, they also seem to reflect Anthony Downes's An Economic Theory of Democracy, an explanation provided by an American political scientist in 1957 of the way in which politics seems to revolve around: do you want more redistribution of taxes through the budget, in which case vote left, or do you want to have more taxes in your own pockets, in which case vote right? Now, it's not quite as simple as that, so you can see these general elections are around employment, protection, defending our way of life in the Conservative Manifesto in 1951, which definitely has a Cold War sub-theme. 1955, perhaps in a very dull election, economics and tax policy is more central to the whole thing, particularly after Rab Butler, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, ramped up the economy in a budget giveaway just before the election was called. 1959, slightly more interesting. Part of the backdrop to the election, the big mistake that Hugh Gaitskell as Labour leader felt to have made was to deny that taxes would have to go up to fund the policies he put forward in the Labour manifesto, particularly around pensions. And the Tories ran with that for all it's worth. But in the run-up to the election, there was also the relationship with Russia. Macmillan goes to Russia early in 1959. He then calls the election when Gaitskell, with a party of his Labour colleagues, had already gone east to do the same kind of thing, thus destroying Gaitskell's attempt to appear similarly statesmanlike. And he more or less launches the election campaign by having a visit from the President of the United States, Dwight Eisenhower, who he had worked alongside, just coincidentally, very happily in North Africa during the Second World War. So clearly a Cold War backdrop to the 59 election. You then have the 64 election, which is dominated by housing issues, by modernisation, which, as I've already said, has a Cold War theme, and also by foreign policy, particularly by the Conservatives. And if the Chinese had helpfully exploded their first nuclear device a few days earlier, before the election, rather than just after, who knows, the few thousand votes that the Conservatives needed to swing in order to that election may have gone their way, and the 64 election may have seen the Tories win 4 elections in a row. As it was, Labour squeaked home with a majority of 3 and were to be the dominant political force for the next 15 years. I would, however, argue that even if the Cold War was not always front and centre to British politics in these years, it was always an essential backdrop. One way in which it forms a backdrop is through the shadow of the bomb. It forms a backdrop to the to British politics in the way in which Sputnik impacts upon the restitution of Anglo-American nuclear diplomacy, leading up to the acquisition of Polaris nuclear missiles in 1962. It also forms a backdrop to the arguments in the Labour Party, and on this slide here you can see, with his finger raised in the middle, Nye Bevan, firebrand of the Labour Party, resigned from the Labour government in early 1951 over austerity prescription charges in order to finance the Korean War, and spends the early 1950s fighting within the Labour Party primarily around foreign policy. After Gateskill becomes leader of the Labour Party in succession to Attlee in 1955, he reaches out an olive branch to Bevan to reunite the party. Bevan becomes Shadow and Foreign Secretary, and in this speech he is making a very famous speech which has gone down in history as the speech about do not send a Labour foreign minister naked into the conference chamber. In other words, don't get rid of nuclear weapons or we won't be able to negotiate them away. We'll have nothing left to negotiate with. As you can see from the images relating to the CND at the top of the slide, however, you have a view that Britain should lead in getting rid of nuclear weapons. Indeed, this view was to concern the Conservative government so much that in the run-up to the 59 election, under Quentin Hogg, Lord Hailsham, the grandson of the founder of the University of Westminster, who was the Minister of Science at the end of the 1950s, a cabinet committee is set up to look at Labour's foreign policy on nuclear weapons and try and work out how to defend the retention of the bomb. Within the ideas animating CND were, as that image of let Britain lead implies, was the idea that Britain was still a leading power which could provide moral guidance for the world. However, simultaneous with this, there is a growing sense that Britain actually has an effete and ineffective leadership. This is marked with the emergence of what comes to be known as the Satire Boom at the end of the 1950s. The obsession with success in the Second World War, reflected culturally in a whole series of films about that conflict, comes to the end at the end of the 1950s, and instead you start seeing the armed forces being satirised in the Navy Lark, first the film in 1959, then a long-running British radio comedy series, in the satire on the civil service, in another long-running BBC radio comedy series called The Men from the Ministry, in films such as I'm All Right, Jack, which lampoons everyone in the British establishment, from the leadership of industry to the trade union movement. The attack on the Foreign Office in the satirical film Carlton Brown of the FO, the attacks on British economic performance, which start to gather with Andrew Schonfield's British Economic Policy Since the War in 1958, followed up with Michael Shanks's The Stagnant Society in 1961, all of which helped to create this sense of urgency about the need to modernise. Many of these books were published in a series of Penguin specials, paperback editions, cheaply available. And the way in which they drew attention to what came to be known as the "What's Wrong with Britain" syndrome really helped to fuel concern and criticism about how Britain was being managed and run. And I suppose all of these come together in the term the establishment, that there was this effete establishment who were presiding ineffectively over British decline. The term the establishment was coined by the journalist Henry Fairley in 1956 to describe the way in which the leading lights of British society had, as he put it, closed ranks over the flight to Moscow of the two British spies turned traitor, Guy Burgess and Donald Maclean. Donald Maclean, the son of a former Liberal chief whip, whose brother worked for Harold Macmillan's family publishing company. So people from the top drawer, as it were. This term becomes taken up, it becomes embedded in the attacks on the establishment of the leading lights of the satire boom, such as Jonathan Miller, Peter Cook, Dudley Moore and Alan Bennett, who launched their satirical review Beyond the Fringe at the Edinburgh Fringe in 1960. It becomes very powerful critique of the then government. Cook goes on to set up a club called The Establishment as a satire in 1961 in Soho, and also launches in the same year the satirical magazine Private Eye. The following year, this is followed by the BBC, no less, launching That Was the Week That Was, the programme which launched the career of David Frost and various other luminaries, and was a weekly satirical show. This marks a shift from news broadcasting being very deferential, which is what it was in the 1950s, to an increasingly critical tone, satirical tone, marked particularly in comedy. In the same year, the journalist Hugh Thomas published an edited collection called The Establishment, a Symposium, which features attacks on all kinds of aspects of British established life. Macmillan and his successor as Prime Minister, Alec Douglas Hume, are being attacked as being the kind of people who run Britain from the grouse moor, run Britain like they're still in the 19th century. And all of this, of course, helps to create the backdrop to a demand for modernisation, not least because it's coupled with a growing appreciation of relative economic decline. Before the 1950s, it was not possible, generally speaking, to compare economic growth rates from one country to the next. By the end of the 1950s, it is. And although Britain grows well during the 1950s, grows at about 2.5%, which for Britain is historically good, Germany, defeated Germany, is growing at something like 4 to 5 times that rate. The sense that the Tories are delivering affluence and success becomes harder to spin in those circumstances, and the early 1960s becomes a race between the two parties over who can most effectively promise a higher growth rate, which will enable Britain to compete with its international peers. The other thing which forms the backdrop to the early 1960s and which takes us back to the Cold War is a series of spy scandals. Burgess and Maclean had fled to Moscow in the summer of 1951. They had been tipped off by a colleague called Kim Philby. Philby himself was removed from MI6 around that time, but in 1955, as Foreign Secretary, Macmillan had denied that Philby was this so-called third man who'd done the tip-off. This only emerges in 1963, by which time Macmillan is Prime Minister, when Philby in turn flees to Moscow. This was, if you like, just one of a series of spy scandals which increasingly impacted upon Macmillan's rule in the early 1960s against a growing, darkening economic climate. You have the arrest, successful prosecution of John Vassell, the naval attaché in the Moscow embassy, for passing secrets to the Russians. He'd been blackmailed. He was gay. You have the Philby crisis. You have, most seriously, the Secretary of State for War, John Profumo, having an affair with Christine Keeler, the dark-haired lady pictured in the middle of the slide, who had also had an affair with the Russian naval attaché in London, Evgeny Ivanov, prompting a judicial inquiry under Lord Denning. All of this happened after an earlier spy scandal at the Portland Naval Base had been exposed in 1961, and the two people pictured here were involved in passing to the Russians the plans for Britain's nuclear submarines. Intelligence, that is, spying, amateurishness, and satire thus seems to have been intimately linked in the minds of this period. Indeed, The Intelligence Men, the title I've given this slide, was also the title of a film made by then leading comics Eric Morecambe and Ernie Wise in 1965, satirising British spying. So a number of themes shape this period. Wildcat strikes, as we can see from the cartoon here, published just before the 1955 election. Decolonisation, modernisation, a shift in morality. All of these are part of the themes of British politics in these years, but the Cold War, and in particular the shadow of the bomb, at least until the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, and the comedy shows that British spying occasionally seemed to threaten to become, are a constant backdrop as well. One should bear in mind that British intelligence services also have their successes, not least with Penkovsky, whose information was vital in the run-up to the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, even though Penkovsky, in the end, partly through amateurish again, lost his life because of it. The amateurish satirised and lampooned in films like I'm Alright Jack is a backdrop to the concerns about modernisation both of the British economy and of the British state, which form so much of the framework for the politics of the early 1960s, leading to Wilson's success in the 1964 general election. And I'd argue that in catalysing the satire boom, in catalysing a particular way of understanding industrial conflict through this Cold War prism of agents provocateurs and enemies within, the Cold War impacted heavily upon British politics in the 1950s and into the 1960s, not through, if you like, the ordinary politics of electoral contests, but through the framework through which British politics was seen. And of course, themes such as enemies within were also to have long-running effects, as were many of the other aspects of this period, as we'll find out when we get on to Margaret Thatcher. Someone who came into politics with the general election of 1959. What happens next is, however, another story.